We are just about to get started with our very special author event tonight with author Michael Keller. But I want to make sure that we have time for everyone to join on, and I'll share a few logistics before we really get started. So, as we're getting started, I want to make sure that you all know where we are and why we're here tonight. My name is Kara. I am a bookseller at Wild Rumpus Books in Minneapolis. And if you've never been to Wild Rumpus before, or if somehow you came across this event online, you've never visited us, we are a children's focused bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we have a bunch of animals and critters running around, which is part of the reason why we're really excited for this particular event tonight. And you might hear some of our birds in the background. You might hear some bird songs. You might see one of our cats kind of come interrupt, but right now they're a little bit sleepy and cozy. So that is us. And even though this is a virtual event tonight, we really want to make sure that it feels as interactive as possible. So we would love it if you could share in the chat and ask questions later for our question and answer session. And to get started, we would love to know where you're tuning in from, and if you have any young readers with you in the audience, or if you yourself are a young reader, could you just type in the chat and tell us how old you are and where you're tuning in from? And then also, as a fun question, because we're thinking about pets tonight, if you could have any pet in the world, what type of pet would you want to have? Just a little thought experiment, and please go ahead and share that in the chat. We'll be watching that. And then you'll also notice in the chat, we're about to share some links both to tonight's book, The Legend of Jet the Gerbil. So you can just go ahead and click on that link to grab the book through us, as well as a 15% off code for your next Wild Rumpus order. And that is good for 1 month. So just make sure to copy that before you leave tonight so that you can get 15% off your order. And lastly, we are going to be having a Q&A session kind of after the bulk of the program and after we get to listen to the book. So start thinking about your questions, and anytime you have them, go ahead and ask them in the chat or in the Q&A box. We'll be watching both of them. So we are really excited tonight to celebrate this book, The Legend of Jet the Gerbil. This is by Michael Keller, who is with us tonight, and illustrated by Patrizia Donaera. So this is all about the legend of a gerbil. We'll get to learn a lot about gerbils tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our author, Michael. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Kara. It's great to be here tonight. Hi, everybody. Thanks for signing on and joining on. I am going to share some stuff about me and sort of how the book came to be. And then one of the things I'm really excited to do is to read the book to you. And the beauty of a children's book is you can actually read the whole book. So as opposed to reading 2 or 3 pages out of a novel, we can cover the whole book. So for those that don't know me, because I think I might have some friends and family on, which is awesome, by the way. So my name is Michael Keller. I was actually born in New York and raised in New Jersey, but I've lived in Minneapolis now for almost 20 years. I came here to work for Dairy Queen, and after working at Dairy Queen, I moved over to work at Pearson Candy Company, where I was actually CEO, and that was 2 years ago. And so I have made a transition from being an executive to, I guess, being a children's book author, although being only 2 or 3 days into this, it's hard to say that I'm a children's book author yet, but I have produced a children's book. I'm really excited about this tonight because Wild Rumpus holds a very special place in my heart. I live about 2 miles from Wild Rumpus, and my kids are now 21, 19, and 16. But when they were little, we spent almost every Saturday wandering around Wild Rumpus with my kids chasing chickens or cats or whatever it is. So it's just really cool for me to be with the Wild Rumpus crew tonight. It's like a dream to have a children's book I wrote end up in a children's bookstore that my kids enjoyed so much. So a lot of people have already asked me, why did you choose to write a book after you left Pearson Candy Company, which is a very good question. And when I left, I had been working for 17 to 18 years straight between Dairy Queen and Pearson Candy Company. And by the time I was done at Pearson Candy Company, I was pretty tired. I was ready for a brain break. I was ready for a body break. And I basically just called timeout. and I didn't know what was going to happen next. I decided not to jump back into the corporate world, so to speak. And I guess just kind of find out what was happening, what was drawing my interest and attention. One of the things that I had always been interested in was writing some kind of a book. I didn't know if it was going to be like a marketing book or if it was going to be maybe personal coaching or personal branding. And I also had interest in a children's book. And then it kind of hit me because I'd been thinking about this for a very long time. Well, maybe this family story about Jet the Gerbil is the story that I should convert into a children's book. And what would be cool about it is it would be a really creative exercise. And writing is a creative exercise in general, but a children's book, I get an opportunity to work with an illustrator and have some fun with that whole process. So that's why I ended up sort of pivoting into this brain break. And I had no idea once I got started a little over 2 years ago, how long the process was going to be and how challenging and interesting and exciting and all that kind of good stuff. Another thing I wanted to point out too is that when I left Pearson Candy Company, I had the privilege basically of being in a position where I could actually take some time to write a book. I had some time, which not everybody has, and I had some savings, which not everybody has a chance to do. So I was in a position where I actually could work on and invest in a children's book a little bit. And I recognize that a lot of people don't necessarily have that opportunity, particular kids and particular kids of color. And so one of the things I decided to do was team up with Young Authors Publishing. They're a nonprofit in Atlanta, and they specifically focus on publishing books for 8 to 14-year-old Black and brown kids to get their voices out into the world. And I learned about them because their CEO, a woman named Lee Hernandez, had actually visited my son's school last year. And that's how I heard about her and her organization. It just feels really good, given the situation I'm in, to be able to donate proceeds of the book to this nonprofit to help kids of color get their voices out in the world. So pretty cool stuff. So people have also asked me, well, why Jet the Gerbil? You know, you could have written about a lot of things. Why did you choose the gerbil? Well, maybe the gerbil chose me. I'm not sure, but gerbils were pets of mine growing up. And Jet was the last in sort of a succession of gerbils that I had. And honestly, the story is really vivid. I remember it almost as well today as I did 5 years and 20 years and even all the way back to 40 years ago. So a vivid story really helps. And also figured if I was going to write a children's book, I really wanted to try to delight kids. I was a kid when the story occurred, and I thought, well, if you're going to go for a children's book, then make it a great children's book. And oh, by the way, if you can make it entertaining and interesting for adults who read the books to their kids, that would be great, because sometimes after we've read a book 20 or 50 or 100 times, sometimes they're hard to get through. So I wanted to make it kind of interesting that way. I grew up in New Jersey, as I said earlier, and gerbils were my first pets. Eventually, I guess we became a dog family. But I had all these gerbils leading up to Jet, and he was the best. He was just bigger and faster and more athletic than all the other gerbils, and he did cool things I had never seen from all the other gerbils before him. And so his story is kind of a unique one. And in a moment, when I share the story with you, I will say that everything in the story I'm about to share with you is true and happened in one way or another. And it'll be fun to get into that with you later. I've also been asked about the process for doing all this, because I'm new to it, brand new to writing a book, so I'm hardly an expert. So all I can really do is share what I've experienced so far. And one of the things I had to figure out, I guess, really quickly 2 years ago was whether I was going to try to get the book published or to self-publish. To get the book published, I needed to find like an agent who would help me find a publisher. It seemed like a very long process. I was a first-time author. Nobody knew me. It seemed like it was going to be very challenging. And I wanted to get the book out in the world while my father, who's 84, who I partly dedicated the book to, could enjoy it and enjoy it in all the ways that you would want your dad to enjoy something. So I kind of felt like the clock was on. So I decided that I would self-publish. I didn't really understand fully what that meant. But one of the things it meant is I had to find a self-publishing services firm. And I looked at a bunch, and I ended up choosing Wise Inc. Creative Publishing, which is actually right here in the Twin Cities. And they work with me to manage the book kind of like a project, and help me find editors and the illustrator and the book designer and the printer and even the distributor who's working with me. And we kind of worked as a team for this entire 2-year period to kind of get the book from idea all the way to market. So it's been a pretty big deal. And I would say the biggest part of all that, the most interesting and exciting and also challenging, was the illustrations. because I'm hardly an artist. I know maybe some good stuff when I see it, maybe as a former marketing person, but I'm not an artist. And we had to go through a really big process, global process, to find illustrators. And we found one who could help me bring my vision of sort of Jet to life. And then she disappeared. We don't know where she went, or why she declined the job, or why we weren't able to proceed with her. So we were literally on the cusp of starting when we had to start all over again. And when we restarted the illustration search process, we came across Patrizia Donaera, whose name is in the bottom of the book here. And she is the one who, as a watercolor wildlife artist, was really instrumental in helping me kind of bring Jet to life, kind of really helped me with my vision for what Jet is, or who Jet was. And it's just an awesome experience working with Patrizia. And in a moment, I'm going to share with you a dedication in the book to Patrizia, because she's not only pretty special, but what she did was pretty special. And I'll explain that in a moment. So I think I'm about to start. I just want to say a few quick thank yous. I want to thank Wise Inc. for helping me get the book from nowhere to where it is today. I want to thank Crystal Coded. I worked with Crystal Coded to build out the website, www.jetthegerbil.com. She was amazing. Crystal's her name, helped me build out the website, and hopefully I just can keep building it and growing it from there. Quentin Nell is the name of a small social media firm that has been helping me with some of the social media, because it's pretty overwhelming, and they're helping me get started. Itasca Books, right here in the Twin Cities, is a distributor of independent authors' works, and they're a national distributor, and they've been incredibly helpful, kind of getting me sort of set up and ready to go. I've already thanked Wild Rumpus, but I want to say thank you again for hosting me tonight. My wife and kids, to whom I've also dedicated the book, and my father, who is, you'll see in a moment, incredibly instrumental. And my last thank you is always to Patrizia, who helped me bring the magic of Jet to life in a way that hopefully excites and delights everybody. So if everybody's ready, I'm just going to take a moment or two, hopefully a brief moment or two, to share my screen with you and to get into the legend of Jet the Gerbil. So hopefully everybody can see that. And I'm assuming Kara or Tim, if you can't see it, you'd be telling me. And so now you get a nice bright close-up of the book, The Legend of Jet the Gerbil. And I've subtitled it, Could Be the Greatest Gerbil Story Ever Told, because I'm not sure that it is. There could be other great ones, but it definitely would be a candidate for greatest gerbil story ever told, as you'll see in just a moment. So we're going to jump in. And the first thing you see when you get into this book is this really cool maze. I used to build mazes as a kid all the time, and I built them for Jet. He ran those mazes, and I built them out of Legos and blocks. And so I actually built this maze on my dining room table a couple of years ago and photographed it and sent it to Patrizia, and she's the one who illustrated this and brought this to life. So I want you to notice the Jet's on the left, and there's all kinds of treats spread throughout the maze, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. So I'm going to skip past sort of the boring stuff there. And what I'd like to do is start by reading to you the dedication, because they're really important to me. So I dedicated it to my father, animal lover, heart doctor, and hero. My mother, who's no longer with us, who did not actually love pets, but would have been very proud of this book. And to my kids, Ava, Davis, and Alden, who really enjoy, or maybe ultimately just put up with, all of my life stories, including this one. And then I get, as I said earlier, unusual for an author to dedicate the book right back to his or her illustrator. I have done that here. I also dedicated this to my gifted illustrator, Patrizia Donaera, who lives in northern Italy with her loving family. Inspired by Jet, she captured the sweet, bright light in his eyes during the dark days of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was particularly bad in northern Italy. So if you're ready, off we go. Growing up, Michael had lots of pet gerbils, but Jet was special. He was Michael's best friend. Jet did amazing things and had unbelievable adventures. Jet became a gerbil legend. Jet was big and strong, fast and brave. So Michael named him after the toy jets that he played with. Jet lived in a big glass tank with an exercise wheel, lots of soft bedding, and a little gerbil house. After school, Michael took Jet out to play. Jet solved the mazes that Michael built for him and zoomed around in his exercise ball like a race car driver. Once in a while, Michael held Jet and told him all about when kids were mean to him at school. Jet listened very carefully. Jet was special for many reasons, and Michael loved him. Jet did everything bigger, faster, and braver than regular-sized gerbils. He was a remarkable chewer. When Michael gave Jet a super long cardboard tube, in just minutes, chomp, 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 it would be gone. Jet loved to run in his wheel. He ran so fast, Michael could barely see it spinning. Sometimes Jet suddenly stopped running, grabbed the wheel, and flew around it upside down. Jet was a daredevil. One day, Michael's black cat got into Jet's tank. Jet stood up on his hind legs, raised his paws like he was boxing, and let out a mighty squeak. The cat leaped right out of the tank. The legend of Jet started that day. Sometime later, Michael was playing with Jet in the corner of the tank while his dad cleaned out the bedding. Dad used a vacuum cleaner hose that in old houses attached to the wall. It was powerful. It sucked the bedding out of the tank and into the big dustbin in the basement. All of a sudden, Jet jumped over Michael's hands and ran straight for the vacuum hose. Michael yelled, "Jet, no!" In the blink of an eye, poof, Jet was gone. Michael's heart sank. His eyes filled with tears. He gasped, "Dad, where's Jet?" Dad looked into the end of the vacuum hose. Jet wasn't there. He ran across the room and looked in the other end of the hose. Michael peered into the hole in the wall where the hose went. Still no Jet. Michael asked, "Could Jet be stuck in the middle of the hose?" Dad answered, "Maybe. Gently squeeze it to see if he's in there." Michael did. Still no Jet. And then it hit them. What if Jet had been sucked all the way through the hose, through the wall, through the floor, down to the basement, and into the dustbin where the vacuum ended? They raced out of the room and down to the basement stairs. They climbed into the dark, scary crawl space where the dustbin hung on a wall. If Jet had made it all the way through the hose, through the wall, through the floor, and into the basement, he would be in there. Stooped over, they crept toward the bin. Dad clicked open the latches and slowly lowered the dustbin to the floor. Michael peeked inside. It was hard to see. Then Michael's eyes widened. In the middle was a fuzzy-looking lump. "Dad, there's Jet," he screamed. But Michael's excitement quickly turned to fear. Jet was not moving. Dad reached into the dustbin, picked Jet up carefully by the base of his tail, and carried him out of the crawl space. Michael followed, staring at Jet, who dangled eyes closed, covered in dust and scrapes. Gently, Dad laid Jet down on top of the washing machine. With the bright light overhead, it looked like a gerbil operating room. Jet still wasn't moving. Michael sniffled. "Dad, is Jet dead?" Dad got busy. "Michael, hold Jet's front legs open like this," he said. "We're going to try to start his heart beating again." As Michael held his friend's paws, Dad gently pushed on Jet's chest with one finger. Michael held his breath. Dad pressed and pressed and pressed, and then poof, Jet coughed up a huge cloud of vacuum dust. Jet flipped over onto his stomach and paws and stared at Michael. "Dad, Jet's alive," Michael cheered. Jet stood trembling as Dad cleaned his wounds. When Dad finished, he said, "Jet, you've had quite the adventure. Now it's time to rest and heal." Tenderly, Michael brought Jet upstairs and put him in his little gerbil house. Dad was Michael's hero for saving Jet. Michael was proud of Jet for surviving the whole vacuum ordeal. But most of all, Michael was happy to have his best friend back. The legend of Jet grew as the story of his incredible adventure spread. In time, Jet returned to being his playful, daring self, except for when he heard the vacuum cleaner. Then Jet hid inside his little house until the vacuum was gone. Who could blame him? The end. And that is the story and the legend of Jet the Gerbil. what I've added to the back of the book are these gerbil facts to chew on. Some really cool stuff and information about gerbils for moms or dads or grandmas or grandpas or babysitters or kids to read and learn about, even for teachers to teach from. And I'll give you just one example of what it sounds like. I'll read the very last bullet point because it's actually relevant to what we just read. So in the lower right-hand corner, you can follow along. Gerbils have interesting social behavior. When they argue about who's in charge, they stand on their hind legs and box each other to sort it out. Jet was ready to box that cat. They thump their hind legs to warn each other or to show excitement. When they are distressed, they might squeak loudly. They often wink when they're eating something especially tasty, and they purr when they are comfortable, even in your hand. They nibble each other to show affection, and a gerbil might nibble you too if you're its friend. So some fun gerbil facts. And the book ends with a little bit about me, some really cool stuff about Patrizia. In the lower left-hand corner, it references the website that has coloring sheets for kids and K-3 science standard-based lesson plans for teachers. There's some fun reading about gerbils for kids. And then of all things, there's actually a great book for parents. Holly Robinson wrote The Gerbil Farmer's Daughter, a memoir. I guess she grew up with a gerbil farmer who had thousands and thousands of gerbils, and it's her story, and apparently it's pretty well reviewed. And the book ends with kind of where we started. And if you've noticed, Jet has moved from the left-hand side at the entrance of the maze all the way to the right-hand side. He's found a giant pile of treats. And very importantly, if you look at the maze, almost all the other treats are gone too. So he did quite a job inside the maze. I don't think he really cared about finishing the maze. I think he cared about eating all the treats. And that brings us to the back of the book. And now I think it's time to flip it back over to Kara as we come out of the book reading. I will stop sharing my screen. There she is.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. That was so lovely. It's so great to be able to see those close details of the book. And I hope that everyone really enjoyed that. As we're just getting to transition into questions today, as you're all thinking about your questions, I was actually wondering, I wanted to ask a question to the audience. Were you all surprised about what happened and how that ending went with Jet having a crisis and being okay? And what did you feel? Go ahead and type a few things in the chat. Just, were you surprised or were you not surprised? And then start thinking about your questions. But we can jump in, especially because the back of the book has such an awesome, the back matter and the details about gerbils. That was really fun. I'm glad you shared one of your favorite gerbil facts. So, but more broadly, I was wondering, what do you want kids to be, who read this book, to be thinking about in terms of the meaning and value of pet ownership?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, because there's so much involved in pet ownership, isn't there? And of course, you're sitting at Wild Rumpus, where you have chickens and cats and birds all over the place. A lot of people have spoken to me about that in the book, because there's a really nice bond between the boy, Michael is a 10-year-old, let's say, and the gerbil, and even his dad, right, who is an animal lover and really cares about his well-being, playing with him, talking to him, cleaning out his cage and all that stuff. And, one of the very important lessons is you have to be very careful. My dad and I made a mistake. We'd cleaned gerbil cages and gerbil aquariums out for years and years and years. Nothing had ever happened. Everything had always gone fine. And then one strange day that happened. And so we learned a good lesson. We were very glad we were able to find and rescue Jet. He deserved that in every way. And I think it's a good way to help kids understand the value of life, no matter how small. Jet looks really big on the book cover, right? But he's about this big, and he really relies on his humans, so to speak, for water and for food and for having a clean tank and for being safe. So I hope that when kids get into it, they realize, well, I'd like to have a gerbil, and then maybe they graduate to cats and dogs as well. Because there's a lot of joy in owning a pet.
Absolutely, yes. And the other thing that kind of struck me about reading and learning more in depth about the book is realizing that Jet was not your only gerbil. And that is kind of a striking thing about getting to know and taking care of pets, that once you kind of get to know a type of animal, you could really really notice so many personality differences in each individual animal. And then, so I'm wondering then how that kind of translated for you into the storytelling and how you tried to capture Jet's personality even, or kind of his character as an animal.
Yeah, that's a cool question because it's entirely true. So I had had a whole bunch of gerbils, maybe starting as maybe like a 4 or 5 year old growing up, and I saw some weird things. I saw things as a kid that you don't normally see, and you have to learn a little bit about life and death because gerbils only live for a few years. I saw some gerbils be born, so I got to see baby gerbils. I had an escape artist who just was determined to get out of the tank and eventually did, and I never saw him again. And I saw like brothers and sisters and what that looked like. I even had a gerbil who was three-legged, and he did his absolute best and he got around just fine. So when I eventually got to Jet, it was pretty easy to tell he was a bigger gerbil than all the ones I had before. And then he was doing things I had never seen the other gerbils do. I'd never seen him chew like the way Jet chewed, like almost like a saw. No gerbil ran as fast as Jet ran, maybe because he was bigger, and certainly no gerbil went flying around the wheel upside down. I thought that was pretty cool. None of my other gerbils had an experience with the cat. I just happened to walk in from school or wherever I was to see my cat in his tank. So you don't see that every day. My guess is it had more to do with how neurotic my cat was than maybe Jet. But Jet, he did his best, right? He was protecting his turf. So what I tried to do early in the book, Kara, was sort of try to establish that Jet was kind of cool in all these ways. He did some special things because I wanted to sort of set him up to have it make complete sense that he could have had an incident with a cat or an incident with a vacuum cleaner and make it through.
Yes, absolutely. And I think those qualities really showed up both in the language that you used and in the kind of examples that you showed of Jet being a daredevil and whipping around his wheel. And I'm glad that you bring that up too. I just wanted to share one of our animals here at the store is Dave the cockatiel. And I love our animal care coordinator who's here and does a wonderful job kind of overseeing the care of the animals, and she knows a lot about birds. So we've always kind of wondered like, oh well, what if one of the birds got out and the cats are around, what would happen? And she said, I would love to see the cats try to take on Dave the feisty cockatiel. He has all the power in his beak and he can defend himself, so it's not always what you would think. And that's another really lovely part of the story. I thought, I was wondering, because it kind of shows like a little bit about crisis management and what happens when things go wrong. And it showed a lot about the character of the dad figure, your dad, and just kind of what happens when things are not as they should be and it's an emergency. So what were you thinking about as you were writing kind of the drama of the story?
Oh, I love your questions, Kara, because that was actually really important to me. The big themes of the book, which are somewhat obvious: hope, grit, resilience, perseverance, survival. And during these COVID times, those themes are actually pretty relevant given what we've all come through. But there's other themes in the book too, the father-son rodent love triangle and how we all felt about each other was a thing. But so too was problem solving. In some ways, and how to deal with issues like that because they happen. And my dad was a physician, so kind of cool, calm, and collected, right? I dropped a little Easter egg hint in the dedication that he's a heart doctor, right? So why did I write that? And write 25 pages later, it becomes relevant. And that was really important because we needed to find him. And if we were like crazy all over the place, time was really important. And my dad was pretty methodical. Let's start with the hose. Then we both realized, because we'd both been living in this house for a while, well, he's not in the hose. There's only one other place we're going to find him. And so off we went. We had to go through that whole process too. He was very careful and very specific in what he did. So I liked the problem solving. I liked some of the thinking on your feet, because sometimes life doesn't go as you expect it to, and you kind of have to figure things out. And this is a good example of that for a little boy, and his dad, and good thing for Jet too, right?
Absolutely, yes. And I could see it kind of took it crisis management of each step at a time. What's the kind of the logical next step? That's as far as we need to think right now. And that really showed through. But I'm glad you mentioned the broader themes too, and the relevance to the experience that we've all been sharing in the last year. So another kind of element of storytelling is the way that stories are kind of told and retold and remembered, especially with family stories. So like what details are retained, what gets forgotten, what gets completely added out of nowhere. So I'm wondering what's the process of kind of storytelling, before you started, before the book was written and published, the storytelling within your family. What are some of those different iterations that happened?
Oh boy, Carrie, you have no idea what you just tapped into with that question. So I don't want to give away my age too much, but this happened 45 years ago, right? So we've been storytelling for decades now. So it's all been oral, right? So it's just shared by family member that way. It almost feels like the way stories were told before there was such a thing as, writing, for example. I did a lot of the storytelling. My dad did too. I tended to do more of it because it kind of occurred to me it was my gerbil, and as I got older, it was easier and easier for me to tell the story. My dad also started making things up that didn't necessarily happen, so we had that little tension of, Dad, that didn't happen. I'll get to that in just a moment. But I will say this, when my father retired from medicine, a little while ago, 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, he had a big retirement luncheon. And I was asked as his oldest son if I would speak on his behalf. And I had no idea what I was going to say. I wasn't living at home in New Jersey. I hadn't watched his last 30 years in his career. All these doctors and nurses and hospital administrators and everybody was around. And then it hit me. I need to tell the story of Jet the Gerbil and see how that goes, right? It's in so many ways, it's about my father. So I told the story to 125 or 150 people, and it killed them, especially because they know my dad. And they just thought it was hysterical that, of course, this cardiologist saves this little gerbil's life. Of course, it would be him. So what they particularly enjoyed, which I shared with them, is that my father had made up an ending. It never happened. So he swears that he gave Jet mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in addition to the heart palpitations. And they modified that slightly to say it was through a straw, which is actually a way you can resuscitate a small animal, is through a straw. That is possible. But it so did not happen. And I had an alternate ending to the book where I had my ending, and then a page goes by, and then there's my dad's ending with Jet himself saying, nah, I don't really think that happened. But children's books can only be of a certain length, and it was starting to get long. So my dad and his alternate ending ended up on the editing room floor, so to speak. And we decided that, well, if my dad's ending is going to have any light of day, it would be during moments like this where we could explain the way he saw it in his mind, which it just didn't happen that way. And if Jet were here, he would say the same thing.
It is so funny how everyone remembers different details of things. And, it's kind of hard to say what the true record was. Maybe we need Jet to tell the story. And that was something that I was also wondering about with, especially with telling a true story, then that kind of places a lot of the emphasis on how you tell it and what language you use. So what were you thinking about as you were choosing the language in the story and kind of those added details that you wanted to put in addition to this true story?
There's a lot in there. And this is where my naivete, or being a neophyte or a rookie, really came into play. Because when I first wrote it, I thought I had when I finally had a full manuscript, I thought it was like a masterpiece. And it was so not a masterpiece. It was a disaster. Unfortunately for me, Wise Ink connected me with one editor right at the start, very briefly, and she just kind of helped me scrunch it down a little bit. It really can't be this long, and think about a few of these things and try it again. So that was helpful. But it was the next editor, a woman named Kelly Hunkren, who to me, she was almost like Yoda. She was just brilliant with so many insights about kids and kids' books. And she kind of got to know me and Jet and the story. And she really helped me figure out the voice, because I struggled with, do I tell it from my perspective? I had a friend, actually my friend who is an author who has the quote on the back of the book. She challenged me to tell it from Jet's perspective. So I'm like, oh my God, I guess I have to try that.
Yeah.
That totally didn't work, because what do you do after he's unconscious, right? He can't, right? So then there's that problem. And so I really struggled with it. And Kelly was one of the key people in helping me get to that third party voice, like almost like there was a narrator. So that way it was a neutral voice who could talk about me, talk about my dad, and talk about Jet, and do it in a way that felt like it could carry the story. So that was important. And I guess for moms and dads out there, or other adults, I was really intent on two things. One, I did not want to dumb the story down just because kids were going to be reading it. I actually wanted to leave some longer sentences in and some bigger words. And they don't necessarily mean longer words, but just, like ordeal, which is it's a big word that adults use. I wanted those to be in there so that kids who could read to themselves would actually be stretched or challenged. I also didn't want to dumb it down, because I did not want it to be one of those children's books that parents dreaded reading again. Like, oh my God, why did you choose that book? Not that one again. I wanted it's kind of like Monsters, Inc. or Finding Nemo. I wanted it to be the kind of book, like an animated movie, that adults enjoyed as well. So I had to make sure that it was entertaining on an adult level as well, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Patrizia really factored into that so well, because her illustrations are gorgeous. You can just kind of stare at them and see more and more detail. And that in some ways was for the adult eyes who could really see all that type. So a lot went on to figuring out the voice in the book. Nice question.
Yes. And it is so true that, picture books are kind of for everyone, but it's very important to keep in mind the caregivers and everyone who's going to be listening and or reading the story themselves. And I'm so glad you brought up more about the illustrations. Could you tell us about what that process was like? Were you going back and forth with Patrizia, or was there kind of a big reveal? Were you surprised about how things ended up looking? Was it different from the way you were envisioning?
Also a really interesting question, because what I expected would happen is not what happened. And remember, I have a bit of a marketing background. So for decades, I've been working with advertising agencies, working on ads for TV or other things like that. So I had some familiarity with like the creative process. So I kind of assumed it would be going a bit like that. Once we had finally chosen Patrizia, we had a lot to do, as it turns out. I had a lot to explain. And she lives in Italy, and she prefers to type in English, but not to talk.
Oh.
And why it was very important to Wise Inc. that they could be in between, because they are sort of managing me and my project, and also Patrizia and her work. So there was actually three of us. The stuff was passing around. And one of the places we had to start was I kind of had to explain my vision for Jet. And it was so hard sometimes to find the words. And really what I was aiming for ultimately was, I didn't want it to look cartoony, but I didn't want it to look so realistic that it wouldn't be something that could really stick out in your mind. So I felt like I wanted a certain amount of realism in illustration. And it's like, does that even exist? But it turns out, yes, it does. And there's a lot of talented artists around the world who do that kind of stuff, including Patrizia. And what I also did for her, which was ridiculous on my part, but I think it was helpful to her, I can't draw. I already explained that. I'm not an artist, but Google Images is loaded with thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands or millions of images of gerbils. So what I tried to do was literally cut and paste a story together in my mind's eye of all the things that Jet did, and it was bad, but it gave Patrizia an idea of, okay, I can kind of see Jet and see how the story unfolds. And she's really good at wildlife. So she knows that, gerbils only have 4 claws on their front paw. Right. And she understands whiskers, and she understands the front teeth. So she was able to look at that and get all the anatomy right, and then bring that to life in her own way. So then what we did is kind of a back and forth. She illustrated some, and then it came back. It wasn't all in order. Like we might've done page 31, then back to page 4. And then like in the middle of the process, the cover showed up, and then suddenly the mazes were, to me, it was like we were wandering around. Right. But there was something about that to her process, and Wise Inc. was managing all that, like, air traffic control, trying to figure out what we had and didn't have. And we iterated a bunch of times. I think a few times I drove Wise Inc. and Patrizia crazy. because I wasn't getting exactly what I wanted or was looking for. And I tried to explain that, and they were very accommodating. And we went back to the drawing board on the cover a few times until the cover as we know it now popped up, which was interesting in and of itself. So it was quite a dynamic process. And Patrizia was a great sport. She later told me in email that I was very demanding, but that she appreciated that because, it really helped her kind of bring Jet to life that way.
Right. It's the collaborative creative process of pushing each other to do more. And I'm glad you mentioned the details about how things emerged and about the cover. And when we were chatting before everyone came on, you said something really interesting about highlighting kind of the difference between the end papers and the inside illustrations. Could you tell everyone a little bit more about that?
Sure. When so I built a lot of mazes as a kid. So it was my opportunity as an adult, a middle-aged adult, to, okay, go at it again. So I went to the toy store, bought all these blocks, and started building mazes on my dining room table. I even used some graph paper, giant size graph paper, to make sure all the proportions were right, all that kind of stuff. Then I photographed it from overhead, sent it to Wise Ink, who sent it off to Patrizia. I didn't know what was going to happen to it necessarily. I don't even think we knew what we were going to do with it. And before I knew it, Patrizia had illustrated it. And it looked like that. It looked, oh my God, the colors were amazing, and the shadowing and Jet in it and the treats. And it's like, wow. But we had thought it was going to end up serving as, I think on page 5, 6, or 7, as an example of how Jet played in my room. Remember, there was that scene where the maze is on the floor and my sneaker and a yo-yo and Jet's running around in the ball, because I built the mazes on the floor. But my project manager, Victoria at Wise Ink, we were spending endless amounts of time trying to figure out what to do with those end sheets. Should they be plain? Should we do something fun with them? If so, what do we do? Is it a pattern? And then I forget the exact detail, and I think it was her idea. What if we use the maze? And then I had the idea that, well, what if it's the same maze, right? Actually, originally I thought, let's put the first half of the maze in the front and the second half of the maze in the back. But the dimensions weren't right. It actually was better to put the whole maze in the front and the whole maze in the back. And then the idea of, okay, let's have Jet start at the beginning and in the back end. One of the things that's really interesting about how the maze turned out is the maze is in primary colors, and the whole book is not. The book is in earthier tones and some cool pastels that support those earthier tones. The book designer, his name is Ryan from Mayfly Design. Oh my gosh, he was so great. This was part of his vision. And we ended up really liking how the primary colored maze contrasted with the color palette of the whole story, and that it's at the beginning and at the end. It wasn't planned. And my wife she's great with color and shapes and texture, and she loves mashups. And this was starting to turn into a bit of a mashup, and we're like, let's go with it. Let's see what happens.
Yes, that's such a great surprise when you see something and say, well, didn't expect it, but it works out so well.
It did.
Yes, that's so cool. And as you all can see, my friend Booker T just joined next to me. He woke up from a nap, so he's a regal cat. We love him very much. And someone was wondering, do you have any other gerbil, or did you have any other gerbils after Jet, or was he the best of the best?
He was the best of the best. I ended on a high note, like, winning the Super Bowl and retiring. So he was the best gerbil. He lived for quite a while after that incident. And I probably was a pre-teenager by then. And dogs were starting to enter our life. And we eventually became kind of a dog family. I have 2 dogs now, probably tied back to then. But I don't know if you can see this here. I'm going to tip up there is Gunny the Gerbil. I asked my son and daughter, who are 21 and 19, how am I going to bring Jet the Gerbil to life on TikTok? Because I'm kind of a big TikTok fan, and it's video driven. It's like, what am I going to do? They're both on TikTok. My daughter's a creator also. And I'm like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And they never told me what I could do. And then for Christmas, they brought home Gunny the Gerbil.
Oh,
and that was their present to me. And then I started filming Gunny doing various things and putting his videos up on Instagram, which gerbil lovers just love. And so now I have 2 dogs, and I'm kind of going backwards. I now have Gunny the Gerbil, and I call him the 10x great grandson of the legend Jet the Gerbil. If you do the gerbil math the right way and how long they live, 10x great grandfather lands him about 45 years ago.
That's awesome. The gerbil generations.
Gerbil generations.
And that's such a sweet gift. I love that idea. And that you were game to take on another gerbil.
I was panicked at first. It's cold and it's like, I haven't cared for an animal like this in a long time. And like, I was obsessed with keeping Gunny alive. That I felt like was my big job.
Right. Well, I feel like, and that's another reason why this is such a great book for families to have, is I feel like it's kind of an inevitable part of pet ownership. I feel like everyone I know has a story of growing up and having a little bit of a oh no moment with caring for their animals. So it's really valuable to have around and to have people think about with their new animals even in their lives.
That's very true. A friend of mine was the former head of school at Lake Country Montessori School here. She did one of the reviews for the book, and she talked a lot about a kid's experience with this type of story and how important it is for a child to learn about care, which we talked about, but also about loss. Because loss is all a part of the life cycle, and it's important to learn about that and kind of grow into that. And so she gave the book high marks because it really, it brought, let's say, a mom or a dad reading to their child, it brings them into that reality, right? And you have to talk about it, right? And maybe even have to stop reading the book and like, did he die? Well, let's read on to find out, or, let's talk about that, or you have to answer questions. And it's important. And I think I underestimated that. I was just telling the story, but to your point, Kara, it really resonates.
Right. So we have a few people actually really interested. After this experience, are you thinking about writing another book, or do you have any more stories to tell about Jet, or it could be other stories? What's next?
Yeah, what is next? So, I've been a children's book author for 4 days now, I guess, because it's been released for 4 days. It's quite a process, but I did enjoy it. And the answer is I do have more ideas. I actually have a half a dozen ideas for Jet that are more loosely based on his life, because he had a lot of great attributes or great skills. So I have like stories that go off sideways on those. But if I were to write a sequel, the first sequel would be what happens when he goes into the hose, kind of like Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. So I'm sort of fantasizing about what he went through when he was in there and the world he experienced and what he saw and who he met, on his way through and to coming back to me. So that's one idea. But I also have another idea that involves birds. And the lake I live near here in the Twin Cities called Bede-Makaska, and it would tie more directly to when I was a bullying victim, and kind of tell the story of a bullying victim and the characters of that story, but do it through birds. I have a close friend who is a world-class ornithologist, which is a birder, and he's taught me so much. And so kind of like I collaborated with Patrizia on these illustrations, or my wife's sister is a veterinarian, I would work with my friend Dave to really make sure I got the bird stuff right, wrapped around a bullying story that also was true. So that's another possibility. So either I keep doing my author thing, or maybe I keep going with Jet, and I haven't figured that out yet.
Right. Oh, both of those sound like really exciting story ideas. But I am also especially intrigued by the idea of getting to learn more about birds and then having such an important message too in a story.
Right.
That sounds so wonderful. I think that was our last question that we had in the chat. As we're just wrapping up, I'll keep an eye out in case anyone has one last thought. But thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. This has been really such a pleasure to have you, to hear the story and to be able to share it with everyone at home.
You're welcome, Kara. Thanks. I really appreciate you having me. I'm so glad it was you and Wild Rumpus too.
Yes, it's a perfect fit. And I want to thank my colleague Timothy, who's been sharing all sorts of links in the chat, which has been wonderful. Links to see videos of Gunny, links to the book. We do have signed copies available, so you can grab your link to our to the book on our website. Make sure to grab your 15% off code as well. And I was so happy, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but so happy to hear that we have people joining us from every coast from all over the country tonight. So that was really cool to see. And
That's
I'm
great.
everyone introduce themselves as we all jumped on. So I don't see any other questions. So that's all we have for tonight. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. And a huge thank you to you, Michael, for sharing your book with us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much again, and you're welcome.
Yes, thanks. All right. So we'll see you. Hope to see you another time, everyone. Have a great evening. We're really glad that you joined us, and everyone take care.